Now, the biggest tragedy or drama with the welfare state exists in less developed countries, which try to prematurely to develop it, and it is extremely distorted. And here are just some excerpts. For example, from the official documents, the World Bank, which this says that the governments dedicate 1/3 of the budget, but usually it goes to the rich. The myth is that welfare state is always to the benefit of the poor. In fact, most welfare states in the world serve the rich, or better off, this may be bureaucracy. For example, in Brazil, 80% of social spending goes to public administration, which enjoy huge pension privileges. But many naive people think, so whenever you say welfare state is good, that masks the drama of the welfare state. In some less developed countries, for example in Bangladesh, doctors are paid but do not work. So this is just like gifts. In India, poor farmers are sending their children to private schools. Why? Because public schools do not function, or function very poorly. So they pay for children's education. So usually, in less developed countries, there's even a bigger problem. And less developed countries, most of them have higher ratio of spending to GDP compared to the Western economies, when the Western economies were at the present per capita income, say, of India. In this sense, less developed countries are over-socialized. And this is one of the burdens. On the development path, there are some exceptions. Until now, the so-called Asian tigers. Asian tigers, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, differed in other countries in many respects, but one of them was that they kept social spending to a minimum, less than 20% of GDP. They enjoyed, partly because of that high savings ratio and reasonable employment ratio, and these two factors were forces of growth, besides some other components. Now, there are many theories which try to explain the growth of welfare state in Western economies, and I am not going to go into them. We know that at the beginning, there was modest welfare state, but much larger non-state mechanisms of dealing with various risks. Families, churches, other civil organizations, individual strategies, etc. And then the welfare state developed. Usually it is Bismarck who is credited with making the first step. And he was anti-socialist, and he wanted to beat the socialists with their own instrument, the welfare state. Now, this is a short story. The expansion of the welfare state was especially pronounced after the Second World War. And you see various countries, but usually it leveled off. In some year, say in 90s or 20s, you see the maximum year here, at much higher level than it had started. And then in some countries it tended to decline very, very slowly, never going back to the original level. And the question was, what explained this fact of leveling off? That was on the one, the most important factor were growing problems. Budget deficits, impossibility or growing difficulty of financing, and various distortions produced by excessive spending. Now, what are the explanations for the growth of the welfare state in Western societies? First, is it because of the growth of poverty? Is it so that people becoming poorer and poorer, and this required the growth of social spending? No. Because the especially pronounced growth of social spending was occurring when people were becoming richer and richer. So the poverty is not an explanation for the growth of welfare state, especially after the Second World War. It's against the facts. So rather the fact that there was an economic growth after the Second World War, in the 50s and in the 60s, which make the financing of increased expenditures relatively easy. It's a more important explanation. Plus, there were a favorable demographic situation. There was a young percentage of young people and small percentage of older people. So it was relatively easy to finance, and this ends, of course. We are now dealing with the problem of aging, which increases the pressure for reforms. And the dilemma is either a crisis or reform. And it's better to reform instead of facing the crisis. Greece is an example of overgrown welfare state plus bureaucracy. This is a very, very clear instance of excesses and their consequences. Now, some theoreticians say welfare state is due to some market failures. Even if we assume that there are some market failures, this does not explain the growth of the welfare state. Because it is not so that market failures were increasing as to justify the growth of the welfare state. So this is the false explanation. This is a pseudo-explanation. So I think, based on my reading of empirical literature, that the driving forces for the expansion of the welfare state was a combination of the factors. Very good situation in the world economy, ease of finance, very favorable demographic situation, political competition based on offering people free lunches, which is, of course, there is no such a thing as a free lunch, so cheating, largely. And strong ideological pressures, and finally something which is called ratchet mechanism. Once you expand social programs, you create groups which defend these programs, and it becomes politically difficult to reduce them. So it's better not to expand in the first place. Now there are some differences across the world. For example, there are some differences between the US and Europe, even though these differences seem to be reduced during last years through the expansion of various programs, including health reform in the US. There are differences which I mentioned between Asian tigers and most of Latin America. There are some differences in post-socialist countries which would require much deeper analysis which I can afford. But the tendency until recently has been for expansion. And the most important breaking mechanism was the crisis, or the perspective of the crisis and growing difficulties. Now, again, very briefly, what are the effects of large and distorted welfare state? There is a huge literature on that. We have a huge gap between political myth, popular myth, and the findings of empirical literature, which makes it, this myth make reform difficult, so we have to weaken them, because they are false.